This is Tony Kube with the Justice for Immigrants campaign. Thank you for joining us today on this webinar. And we're just having a little bit of a short time here. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started with this webinar today. Thank you for joining us. We have some really good presenters on the phone. We have Matthew Westerbeck and Kat. They are with Catholic Charities of Oregon. My colleagues here at USCCB MRS, Todd Scribner and Matthew Welch. Just a few housekeeping items. Let's see here. There's a chat box at the bottom of your screen on the bottom right-hand corner. I'm going to type into it in a minute here. And we haven't unmuted phones for folks who are watching the webinar, because then we'll just get a lot of feedback and we'll get a lot of background noise. So if you have any questions for our presenters today, please type them in the chat box. We are going to take as many questions as we can, but you know, unfortunately, there's only a limited amount of time, and it looks like we have quite a few participants on. So we'll try to take as many questions as we can. Please type them in the chat box, and what we don't get to, we'll give you instructions at the end for submitting post-webinar questions. Okay, so one other item. This webinar is intended for folks who are on the JFI network. It's to be an off-record discussion. So if there are media folks on the phone or on the webinar, please identify yourself by typing into the chat box. And this webinar is being recorded. So if you are with the media and you have questions about the content presented in this webinar, please email the person there on the start page of the webinar. It's mpriceman@usccb.org, and he can handle any media inquiries related to this webinar. As I mentioned, presenting today, I'm Tony Kube, the USCCB National Manager, and then my colleague Matt Welch, and my other colleague Todd Scribner here at USCCB Migration and Refugee Services, and Matthew Westerbeck, who is the Outstanding Resettlement Director for Catholic Charities of Oregon. He's in Portland, Oregon. So let me turn it over to Matt Welch to start off.
Thanks very much, Tony. First, okay, so in terms of the landscape, over the last 3 years especially, it's been a challenging one. And thanks all for joining the call. It helps so much for all of us to come together at these challenging times, and as people of faith, to pray for the kind of resilience that refugees themselves have, and we need that kind of resilience as advocates as well. As we look at some of the challenges and the trajectory over the last 3 years, there's been, unfortunately, a declining commitment by the administration, as seen through three executive orders, and then a recent fourth executive order on refugees. And those have had the impact of decreasing access to refugee resettlement over these last couple of years. And then also with three consecutive all-time low presidential determinations. We're still waiting for the official word on this year's, but since 2017, there's been a reduction, assuming that this 18,000 presidential determination comes through for 2020, an 84% reduction in that commitment over that time. So that's we're urging at every turn for the administration to restore the program, And I know all of you are an important part of that advocacy. And as I talk about this, the items here, I'll mention also resources that can be helpful in addressing these things. The second thing that we note, though, at the same time that there's been a declining commitment by the administration, Congress, especially the appropriators, have really maintained strong funding for both the Office of Refugee Resettlement and also for the Bureau of Population, Refugees, Migration, so-called PRM. So we're really grateful for that, and I think it's for all of us, I think, a sign that there is a lot of bipartisan support that continues for refugees, a lot of goodwill to build on from that. The other thing to note, as we're all painfully aware, that this trajectory over the last couple of years has caused a reduction, especially in the domestic infrastructure, and we all feel that in very deep and personal ways. I know the place I grew up in, Iowa, used to have, for 40 years, a resettlement program, and that was taken out over the last year or so. So that's really, really hard on local communities. Let's go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the current moment now, we have a couple of challenges, especially one, that low presidential determination that I mentioned a minute ago. And we're concerned, of course, of the low number. We celebrate that 18,000 people will have a chance for new lives in the United States, so we celebrate that. But we also know that as a country, we can and must do better than that. That over the 40-year history of the program, it's a 95,000 PD average per year, that refugee goal. So we need to do better than the 18 for sure. There were some other concerns about the presidential determination as well, and partly that it also doesn't cover the world in the same way that previous presidential determinations have. In other words, there's not a region by region, very systematic look at the needs. So we're concerned about that. But as I say, we continue to work hard to welcome those who we can welcome this year, and that full 18,000. On the executive order, you all probably have had some understanding of what that new executive order is. Basically, it comes out of 2017 when there was an earlier executive order that said there would be a proposal coming down the pike that would involve state-local involvement in resettlement, and this is that new proposal that's come, which essentially creates a new rule whereby in order to be resettled in an area, there has to be consent for the person to be there. So these are the challenges facing us, and we'd urge everybody to go to the JFI website. Also, Refugee Council has good materials on this as well. So for the next slide, please. So what do we do? Well, first of all, we strengthen that bipartisan congressional support that we see signs of by continuing to urge Congress to make resettlement a personal thing of their state, of their district. So they're supporting refugees face-to-face and through their work in Congress. There's also the GRACE Act, which would put in a minimum of 95,000, that average number for the refugee goal every year. A second thing is to build that state-local support with public statements, and also when the time comes for consent, if that process goes forward, we're also mindful that it could likely be challenged in court for its legality, but we do, at any rate, want states and localities to express their strong support, whether through that formal consent process or through other public signs of support. And then, as always, we're working to build collaborations in the Catholic world and also beyond. So next, please. In that spirit, on today's call, we're focusing especially on two different things. We're blessed to have wonderful Catholic Charities partners across the country, and we're always finding new and innovative things that are happening there. That and what we try to do as coordinator of the network is really hold those different things up and put a spotlight on them, so that we can learn and share with one another. And so we're currently in that process of exploring with Catholic Charities of Oregon and others about how to help build the Catholic network response at the state and local level and the capacity at that level to advocate and also to serve. A second part of the call that we're excited about as well, the first part, Matthew Westerbeck from Catholic Charities of Oregon is going to talk about. The second part of USCCB collaboration with universities, Todd Scribner from here at MRS is going to talk about that. So with that, without further ado, I pass it on to Matthew.
Matthew, can you hear me okay? Yes, Matthew, I'm going to put you on speaker, okay? Go ahead, Matthew.
Perfect. Sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. My name is Matthew Westbrook, the Resettlement Program Manager at Catholic Charities Oregon, and I'm here with my colleague, Kat Kelly. You might not hear from her, but she was also key on the success we had here in Oregon, so I want to make sure to call her out as well. We're excited to share with you all today some of the tools and strategy we developed in the past year in order to pass Oregon's Welcoming Refugees Bill, Oregon House Bill 2508. Can you skip ahead one slide? Thank you. And we're hopeful that this information and the tools that we're sharing today will be able to help you all get similar legislative strategies started in your states. And to begin, we want to highlight one of the things that we'll mention throughout the presentation today, and that is bipartisanship. You'll see on that reader board, on that top left graphic on the slide, that this bill had 27 yes votes and 0 no votes in Oregon Senate. And in the House, the vote was 55-3, so almost a unanimous vote and bipartisan. And we want to highlight this so that we frame all of the forthcoming legislative efforts in that same spirit, which is the opportunity to create bipartisan state-funded services for refugees. This is a real opportunity to have both parties at the state level engaged in our work, and I think we demonstrated that strongly in Oregon. Next slide, please. And I also want to call attention to another key component of our strategy, and that is we built a collaborative in order to pass this bill. All three of Oregon's refugee resettlement agencies, we all came together in a strong spirit and effort of collaboration. And I know that in some areas there's struggle, the teamwork between resettlement agencies and the collaboration is strained, or it's not as strong as you would like it to be. But I can't stress enough that we would not have been successful if it were only Catholic Charities that was working on this bill. It was imperative that legislators understood that the funding was not about one agency, but about the preservation and stabilization of services for the families that we work with. And we also needed the support from an advocacy organization, and that's Unite Oregon. And as an advocacy organization, they were the ones that were able to both really organize community members, helped us to craft messaging, media engagement, developing materials, and also the social media component of the strategy. So we strongly encourage you to partner with an advocacy organization in your area if you have one that is focused on immigrant and refugee populations. And then lastly, the last partner listed, ERCO. They are the largest service provider for immigrants and refugees in Oregon. They don't do refugee resettlement, but they provide other services. And the attacks on the refugee resettlement infrastructure is impacting not only RAs, but the additional service providers and MAAs in the resettlement network, and of course all the clients that they serve. With all of us partnering together and having a strong, unified voice, we were much more effective than we otherwise would have been. Next slide. All right, so to start with the actual strategy implementation and some of the tools we want to share with you today, one of the first things that we want you to do or start thinking about, and as quickly as you can, is to find a legislative champion. Somebody in your state legislature or assembly that is willing to champion the bill and commit it into the legislature so that it can be taken up and worked on, hopefully voted on. Identify a legislator that you think will be supportive of this effort, somebody that has already spoken publicly about supporting immigrants and refugees, an individual whose district is home to a large community or communities of refugees, an individual who sits on important committees within the legislature that will hear and process the bill. And this is where we're thinking of like the Human Services Committees, Healthcare Committees, and or Housing Committees. We also want to encourage you to find somebody that is willing to work on both sides of the aisle, someone that has a proven record of doing that and has a strong relationships with legislators on both sides. And here again, we're focusing on the bipartisan nature that needs to be at the beginning of this effort. Having a champion that can engage colleagues on both sides is key. For example, our legislative champion has the highest density of refugees of any district in Oregon. She's a progressive Catholic, and she's also a former chief of police. So you can see how she's well-positioned to talk to her colleagues on both sides of the aisle. Next slide. Another key strategy is to get as much community engagement as you can. So are there events, community meetings, other ways where the public has the opportunity to learn about refugee resettlement and learn about what is happening across the country to refugee resettlement and the peril that it is creating for the communities that we work with and that we welcome and serve. Here at Catholic Charities Oregon, we've been inviting community members to help us welcome families at the airport and participate in airport arrivals, and we've been doing this for over 5 years now. These welcoming opportunities have sometimes turned out 50 to 80 people to help us welcome families. And for us, this was a natural way to engage the community on the bill and how they could help support that effort. On this slide, what you're seeing is the community that gathered early this year for an arrival at Portland International Airport, including a handful of the legislators that will become key in ensuring the bill's passage. Next slide. And for that arrival, we also invited the media to the airport, and that's what this slide is representing. The local NPR affiliate covered the arrival and did a couple of follow-up stories throughout the legislative session. And many, if not most, of our programs across the country have existing relationships with the media, especially within the past nearly 3 years now. I think there's been a lot of outreach from the media into our programs trying to understand what's happening. So I think there's a natural opportunity for us to engage them on a legislative initiative. So invite them to a community event, tell them you're working with the legislature on creating a historic bill, provide them the opportunity to interview staff and community members. This is a really key way to how they can help you educate the public on who refugees are, on the process of refugee resettlement, the effects of reduced arrivals, and also an opportunity to share with the media the history of this work going back to World War II, and that it has also always been bipartisan. At the same time, it's been bipartisan and been almost 80 years now. It's also been done very, very quietly, and engaging the media is a chance to help change the national narrative and engage more stakeholders. These are great educational opportunities, and for sure we want to make sure that we're preserving and safeguarding confidentiality and safety, and to give clients the power to say no if they don't want to be interviewed or have their pictures taken. But again, I can't stress enough the power of these community events. Next slide. So, significant part of the work, I think, in any legislative initiative of this sort is going to be education. Educating legislators on everything related to refugee resettlement. Most legislators know very, very little, if anything, about this work, about who refugees are, that they are the most vetted individuals to enter the country. They know little or nothing about the history of refugee resettlement, that it has always been bipartisan in Congress, that the largest numbers of refugees admitted in 1 year were under the Reagan administration. So here I'm kind of listing really some of the key points that we would bring up in every conversation with legislators to really help educate them on the work and what is happening to it. The current narratives surrounding refugee resettlement have completely dominated what people are hearing. They do not know the facts and the truth, and in order to share information and do this education is necessary so that they understand the issue and what is happening to refugee resettlement. We are showing you here is our one-pager. Quickly and concisely explains the bill, what the crisis is, how the bill addresses the defunding of services and replaces them with state dollars. So this is one of our educational materials that we created. There was also an FAQ, a fiscal one-pager. We had an internal messaging document, postcards that were placed on legislators' desks during key points throughout the legislative session, letters to legislators, endorsement forms for organizations and businesses to sign on to, and all these other materials. We can share those with you if you'd like. Next slide. And continuing with this theme of education, another or two activities that we did that were really successful were advocacy days and what was called a lunch and learn. So advocacy days, we partnered with other organizations that were bringing their community members to the Capitol to meet with legislators. It's a real crucial opportunity for community member involvement. Refugee community participation is essential, and I can't stress enough how much legislators value hearing directly from their constituents. I was incredibly honored to be working almost daily with legislators on this as an advocate and as a lobbyist. But the conversations that they were able to have with their actual constituents and those individuals that identify as refugee were much, much more powerful than the conversations I was able to have. They need these conversations and enable to understand what is at risk if refugee agency services go away. And I also think this is an important opportunity for our newest neighbors to see how their government works and that they absolutely have a voice in this process. And then we also convened a lunch and learn for legislators and their staff. We provided free lunch and then a panel for them to have the opportunity to hear from refugees who wanted to share their stories and express why refugee resettlement is important and necessary and why it needs stable state funding. We had about 50 legislative staff attend our lunch and learn. And it also was key because it provided us just another opportunity to engage them and answer their questions. Next slide. So coming back to the necessity of grounding this work and the advocacy in a bipartisan spirit, we want to share with you some of the key messaging and talking points that we shared with legislators. From the very first days, going all the way back to last December, we focused extremely hard on making this a bipartisan bill. And I say that even though Oregon has a supermajority in both chambers of the legislature and also a Democratic governor. We focused on the historical bipartisan nature of refugee resettlement, going back to World War II, the Refugee Act of 1980, and then on the slide you can see more of these talking points. We also highlighted that the loss of services would have negative effects on vulnerable populations, such as families falling through the cracks, lower student outcomes, decreased employment opportunities, negative health outcomes, and more. And we also wanted to point out that we think an investment from the state up front saves money in the long run by providing increased supports for upward employment mobility, and that services help families to decrease access on public benefits. Next slide. And one of the perhaps strongest selling points for fiscally conservative members of the legislature were to really educate them on the economic contributions that refugees and refugee communities make, both at the local, state, and national level. We focus very hard on educating legislators on these points. And on this slide are those talking points. And we also wanted to use this as an opportunity to really push back against the current narrative that refugees are an economic drain on our country. The facts and the data tell a very, very different story, and legislators need to have this information. They need to know that refugees are an important and positive economic contributing members of our communities. And for me personally, to call out one of those statistics, the most eye-popping and profound statistic is that the average refugee household has a yearly income within 25 years of arrival that is $14,000 more than the total average of all U.S. households. Most legislators were not expecting this data, and it was essential, again, to really engage fiscally conservative members. And next slide. So in addition to the education and the advocacy and explaining the economic benefits of refugee resettlement and refugee communities, we also recruited and engaged partners from many sectors and sought their endorsements. And this is the backside of our one-pager, showing all of the businesses, nonprofits, and healthcare providers with their logos. And here, too, I can't stress enough how impactful it was to show legislators the number and spectrum of partners that endorsed our bill. Having these businesses, business organizations, and healthcare systems endorse the bill is a powerful way to show legislators that key sectors of our community support refugee resettlement and support the bill. I would suggest to start doing outreach right now to community partners and to businesses and ask them if they would endorse and support your initiative. It's also possible that they can help you identify a legislator that will be a champion. And we also want to put an emphasis on the importance of having the support of powerful lobbying partners, specifically such as the healthcare systems. Here in Oregon, we have the support of Providence healthcare system, and when they joined us for meetings with legislators and in committees, we just had fundamentally different and tremendously successful conversations. They are a vital partner for these initiatives, and they are very highly regarded in state capitals because they understand the systems and how much dollars can be used for going to services upstream and helping families rather than addressing crises downstream. Another strong partner and support came from the Oregon Catholic Conference, and we think this is a key strength of the Catholic network that we can bring to all the collaboratives that we want to build across the country. Next slide.
Hey, Matthew, before we get to the next slide, there's a question here for you. So can I ask you this question? So the question is Matthew talking about all immigrants or just refugees when you talk about the economic advantages? Great question.
Yeah, thank you. That is a great question. That data is specific to refugees. We did a decent amount of research, quite a lot of digging around for journals and articles. And I can't remember specifically which one that comes from. We can get you that information. But it is speaking specifically about refugees.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. And thank you, Sister Barbara, for the question. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide, Matthew.
Thank you. All right, so moving more forward with the sort of different components of the strategy, you're going to need materials and things to hand out to staff, to legislators, community members, and really anyone that you want to help spread the word. What was surprisingly effective for us was a sticker. So that's that brown outline of Oregon where it says Refugees Welcome HB 2508 that you're seeing on the slide. These were extremely popular items to hand out and give to legislative staff, to advocates. People would put them on their phone cases, on their computers, and they just really became conversation starters. It was surprising for us that a small investment, we probably could have made twice the number or 3 times the number and given them all out. And people still proudly display them on their phones. So these materials, such as a sticker or a T-shirt, postcards, are going to be, I think, strong and necessary items for any initiative. The T-shirts that we made, people would wear them to committee hearings, on the advocacy days that I mentioned, to airport arrivals and other community events. And then, of course, there's social media. And for us, this is one of the key strengths at Unite Oregon, which is our advocacy partner. They were able to be point on that. Just in terms of the 3 resettlement agencies, we don't have strong social media skills in-house, but they did, so we were able to partner with them. They created a specific Facebook page for the collaborative, and by the end of the session, when we posted the picture of the winning vote, that post had over 10,000 views. Next slide. One of the last big pushes we did was to hold a press conference at a local church late in the session. And due to our media engagement earlier in the session, we were able to have press cover the event and highlight the status of the bill and what the legislature needed to do in order to pass it. We had all of the collaborative members present. We invited community leaders and community members from the large number of refugee communities that have been resettled in Oregon going back for the past 40 years to demonstrate the long history of this work. We also sent press releases to print and TV media at crucial times during the bill's journey. And this is another point where I want to highlight the importance of having a collaborative. All of these events and focused efforts are definitely resource intensive, and the ability to share the work across numerous organizations is essential. And it's also another opportunity to have the public and the media see and hear the unified voice of all the resettlement agencies, and that strengthens the initiative as well. All right, next slide. Thanks for hanging in there, everybody. I apologize. This is a lot. So now we're on to the future. So we did pass HB 2508, almost unanimous in Oregon. We are already looking to the future. In Oregon, this is a 2-year funding bill, so we want to know how to make that permanent. One of the key areas that we are excited to be partnering on is research that's being conducted that will show, we think it will show the effectiveness and the better outcomes that an extended case management model makes possible. So RAIN International, which is the Refugee Assistance and Information Network International, they're partnering with a local research university, and they're doing a research study to evaluate and measure the success of this new model. And then we're also working closely with our state refugee coordinator, as they are very interested in seeing the results of the research, because they want to take that to the legislature themselves and make the funding permanent. And I think another opportunity here that we're starting to start to get a better sense of is how generating state support, getting state involvement in this work, I think is going to help shape the conversation moving forward about how states should be part of refugee resettlement moving forward as we start thinking about and looking at refugee resettlement 2.0 after the current administration is no longer in office and we are returning back to doing refugee resettlement much more historic averages and also with a refugee-friendly administration. So lastly, last slide, I just want to end again, another call essentially to build a collaborative. So that's why we're listing on the last slide all the partners that were involved in this work. These are the organizations that were behind HB 2508. I think just moving forward, we need the states where this is possible to launch an initiative. We need them to see that this is about preserving our country's ability to continue doing refugee resettlement and welcoming the stranger and helping them rebuild their lives. And one of the strongest ways to help create that message is to have a group of organizations with a strong, unified voice about how states can help address this crisis. And that is everything for me. Thank you for listening and for your time. I'm happy to answer more questions.
Thank you, Matthew. Well, folks, if you have any questions for Matthew, please do type them in the chat box. We will get to as many as we can. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over back to Matt. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm going to turn it over to Todd, Todd Scribner, to provide some more information that you all can use. Todd, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, go ahead, Todd.
Hey, thanks, Tony. You can go to the next slide. It's fine. I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk to you all about some initiatives that are kind of overlapping potentially and related to kind of our efforts to build up the resettlement program in this kind of difficult time, and some sort of initiatives that I think we can sort of join together in furthering. The main one that we've been working on recently, and I know that I've engaged some of you already on this, and some of you have become involved in this program, it's this refugee resettlement and sort of integration and religion project that we're carrying on with Princeton University. The goal of this project is to better understand the way in which religion assists in the integration of refugees and other forced migrants, really. It's kind of broader than just refugees. It originally started out with a focus on that population, but it's extended somewhat. But how religion affects their integration. In other words, how do refugees use religious symbols, rhetoric, institutions as they sort of make a life here in the United States? How do local communities use, symbols and language in support of refugees after their arrival? Welcome the stranger kind of rhetoric, that sort of thing. But also, how do some religious institutions and local communities actually use religious rhetoric and institutions as a way to try and keep refugees out? So better understanding this dynamic as it points to the integration process, we think is an understudied and important aspect of what we're trying to do. And what we want to do on a practical level is help to bring together resettlement agencies, resettlement practitioners, people who work with refugees and other forced migrants, asylum seekers, and so forth, create a much larger network that will connect, sort of Catholic groups and secular groups and Protestant groups and Jewish groups and others who may not always be in communication with one another, so that we can have a much stronger voice nationally. And we can also help each other to inform each other on best practices and to engage in perhaps unexpected initiatives that we don't realize now. So part of this initiative will bring together, symposiums a couple times a year. We have one upcoming in Princeton University shortly, and some other things, including, you can go to the next slide, Tony. One of the big things is an oral history project. So we recognize that refugees are often marginalized populations and their voice isn't heard. And so what we want to do is bring together refugees, individual refugees, to provide an oral history of their experience, both related to their displacement, but really focus primarily on sort of their resettlement and, again, the role that religion plays in their their lives. Some we found so far that some have become extremely religious as a consequence of this experience. Some have fallen away from the faith. Other people have converted from one faith to another. And so there's a wide array of experiences. And we think that when we collect these oral histories, there's really, which will be held at least initially at Princeton University, but we also hope to put them online and make them accessible more publicly to people who want to use them. It'll really open up the door to better understanding refugee populations, telling their stories, and hopefully creating a much stronger sense of compassion for them and understanding for the experiences that they've been through, and kind of get away from this, refugee as threat narrative that sometimes permeates the discussions today. And so this brings us really to sort of opportunities for collaboration. You can go to the next slide, Tony. And so one of the things that we're looking at doing is creating new partnerships with universities, and also helping you all, if you're interested, to create partnerships with the universities. One of the reasons that we're doing this is that we've come to recognize that the diverse skill sets present in universities, on the one hand, nonprofits on the other, advocacy agencies, so on and so forth, the different types of organizations, they bring different skills to the table. And when we bring these different skills together, such as a research arm of a major Princeton university, along with the advocacy arm of the USCCB, we can be really creative in the way in which we engage issues of common interest. So in this case, our work with refugees and refugee populations. And one of the things that's come out of this is a kind of more broadly beyond this particular initiative that I was just speaking about, is a much more intentional effort to create intern programs. And so we have interns coming to the USCCB from the University of Dayton, from Notre Dame, from Princeton University, and elsewhere, that they work, in part on areas of interest to us, but also, the Princeton students will come and work on the oral history project while they're here. And so it's kind of a win-win for everyone around. And one of the things that we're interested in exploring further, if there's an interest in the field, is trying to nurture relationships with universities so that interns might be sent to Catholic charities around the country. If this were to occur, for example, something similar could take place that occurs here. That they would be placed perhaps over the summer. A student would be placed from Princeton University over the summer at a local Catholic charities. They would have the opportunity to be exposed to the work that you do, help you with research, help you with kind of outreach, help you with volunteer work, whatever it might be, on the one hand, but also really have an opportunity to kind of further the religion and resettlement project that we're working on with Princeton. So maybe you could help introduce them to refugees who are interested in their oral histories being taken. So it could be a very mutually beneficial opportunity for everyone involved. And as we start sort of engaging universities and Catholic charities, for example, my sense is that there are going to be opportunities for new initiatives that we're perhaps not really aware of yet at this point. That's what's happened in our experience, and I see no reason to think that it wouldn't happen in yours. And so, it would also maybe entail us contacting local Catholic universities in your area, and you could do the same, obviously, but maybe trying to nurture relationships that we could create kind of intern programs or something related, research projects that could further your goals while furthering their goals as research institutions. So this is just some brainstorms that we're having. I'm kind of throwing this out there at the moment just to kind of test the interest level that you might have in this sort of a initiative that we might be able to move forward, in the coming weeks and months. So please let us know if this would be of interest to you, and we can brainstorm further how we might be able to help each other. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Todd.
Sure.
I'm going to go ahead and turn it over back to Matt Wood.
Thanks very much, Tony. And thanks, Todd, and thanks, Matthew. We really appreciate those presentations. And not just to hear about them, but also we're very interested to know, for everybody who's on the call today, which I think is about 50 people or so, is to know whether you're interested in engaging the way that Matthew described so eloquently and really thoroughly in a very helpful way with different steps that can be taken locally to have the kind of success that that the community had there in Oregon, with a lot of really great leadership from the Catholic Charities, but also lots of really all the different gifts of the community coming out, as Matthew noted, at different points. So are folks interested in either to mention that on the call here through the chat box, or also feel free to contact me after the call as well, because we're very interested to know what the level of interest is on really taking on the kind of advocacy that with support, but that Matthew described that they took on in Oregon. Also, as you heard Todd there describe, there's the very specific current project with Princeton, but also kind of the exciting opportunities with Catholic universities in your area to try to build interest or share the interest that perhaps you've already built, having interns come to your program. So with that, I urge you all to be in contact with us about those things, and then I'll just hand it over to Tony to kind of moderate this Q&A here for folks as different questions might come in the chat box.
Thank you, Matt. Folks, we have about 15 more minutes to take some questions. You can go ahead and put them in the chat box there. We have a lot of, I like to say, intellectual horsepower arrayed before you with Matt and Matthew and Todd. They also have really great ideas that they can help you with. So I invite you to go ahead and ask any questions you might have in the chat box. I'll turn it over to Matt or Todd or Matthew, depending upon the question. While you're formulating your questions, I also want to make a pitch for our next webinar, which is related to this in many ways. On October the 30th at 2 p.m., we're going to have a webinar on National Migration Week. That's 2 p.m. Eastern. If you receive the Migration Monday emails that we send out every Monday, or the JFI Week in Review, there's one that's going to come out this Friday. There will be information about the webinar on the 30th on the Migration Monday, the next one coming out, and the Week in Review. If you do not receive those email newsletters or email information, go ahead and send me an email, and I will include you in the list, in both those lists, and I will send you the invitation and the information for the webinar. So it's open to questions, and I see some folks are typing here. Let's give folks another minute to come up with questions. We certainly don't need to stay till the top of the hour, but I do want to give folks the opportunity if they have questions. I know that Matt Welch, Matthew Westerbeck, and Todd Scribner they have a lot of work to do, so I want to be mindful of their time as well. But let's give you folks another minute or two to ask questions if you have any. Matthew, this looks like a question for you. With this nationwide state legislative initiative, how long would it take to build up a nationwide refugee resettlement program? Great question from, I think that's from Christopher. Matthew, can you hear me okay?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, hear you just fine.
Hi, this is Matt Wilch, and we're trying to get Matthew back on the phone. But I could answer some of that because we're at USCCB very interested in building that state-local capacity within the local Catholic Charities partners. And I think of course, it's an ongoing thing, and we can always get stronger and stronger. But we think with some crucial upfront investments in some of the infrastructure, there's some great possibilities. And as Matthew mentioned on the phone as well, there's really important assets that we have in the community as a whole. You know, for example, we at USCCB are regularly in contact and also have convenings with the state Catholic bishops' conferences and collaborate with them often on many things. So we think this especially, and we do now advocate or collaborate a lot with them as well on refugee stuff, but I think we're very interested in exploring, you know, a greater collaboration and even stronger collaboration there. And then also we're very interested in strengthening, working together with the network to strengthen the state level advocacy as well. And I think, Matthew, for sure you could, I mean, it'd be really helpful especially to know, like in Oregon, kind of what the steps were for you as you were building that up and how long a process has that been? I think we've got you back on now, so.
Yeah, Matthew, so the question was, how long would it take to build a nationwide refugee resettlement program?
Can everybody hear me? Tony and Matt?
Yeah, sorry, Matthew, go ahead. I mean, Matt framed it really well. Go ahead.
Can you fill me in really quickly also on what Matt said? We were not able to hear what he was saying.
Sure. Yeah, sure. I can sort of just. Good. Network building. Just that we are, as coordinators of the resettlement network across the country, have regular convenings, especially on service on the service side, but also I think just trying to build even stronger advocacy capacity that would build not just on the state level, which would be really good, but also even stronger on the national level. So we're very interested in further exploring that as we're moving forward during these challenging times. And I think especially, like as the question, I guess I'd be particularly interested on the part of the question, Matthew, for that Chris raised about what did it take there in Oregon for you to build up to the current state of both within your agency, to have the kind of capacity you have within your agency, and then also to build the collaboration with others. So if you could kind of describe that capacity or that sort of growth on the local level, that would be really interesting. Thank you.
That we think is essential. Well, a couple of things, but how do we get there as part of the strategy is we decided middle of last year or so to be very proactive in the state and exploring ways that we could have the state step forward and be a supporter of refugee settlement to not only replace the funds that have been dismantling, the dismantling has come from the defunding of the network, but we really wanted the state to understand how essential this work is and the history of this work being a country that welcomes immigrants and refugees. We wanted to be very proactive in getting their partnership on stepping forward into that space. It definitely did require a different position for a resettlement agency, not only in building collaborations with the other resettlement agencies and also but how to partner with an advocacy organization. And I think this is just a moment in time that is unlike any other in history since refugee resettlement began, at the very least, which requires some, I guess I'll use the word aggressive response in order to make sure that the narrative that is being deployed and has been really successful in terms of creating a lot of disinformation, a lot of confusion, a lot of anti-immigrant, anti-refugee policies. Being proactive and being aggressive and engaging elected leaders, and specifically the state, and now, of course, with the executive order, cities and locales and county commissions. It's just a necessary response that we have to take. In terms of capacity, that is something I didn't mention at all in the slides, and it's a great question. We had the support of a couple of foundations that came together shortly after the election to specifically focus on supporting service providers that work with immigrants and refugee populations, and as well as the Family Foundation. I suggest going to your development team, if you haven't already, to see if there are possible partnerships that you could engage them on in order to create the capacity with some. It doesn't have to be coming necessarily from one partner only within a collaborative. That's just the way it worked out for us here in Oregon. Everybody was involved. I just was the point person. It doesn't have to be a structure. It can be split across multiple organizations, but it will require building capacity, and definitely the private dollars there are a key component of that. But again, when presenting funders with the necessity of what the response needs to be and how we can make sure that the narrative that is being deployed isn't the only narrative that is in the public sphere, I think funders are going to be responsive. That's my 5 cents.
Thank you, Matthew. Great answer. A question here for Matt Wilch. Matt, do we know yet what form the required consultation with state and local leaders will take in order for each state and local community to continue to receive refugees?
Thanks very much for that very timely question. And we're not, to answer in the general question, we're not sure yet what the final form will be for that engagement. So far, there has been a meeting with PRM that occurred, and in which there were some initial conversations with the voluntary agencies that do the resettlement. And so it appears that at this point they want to engage with the resettlement agencies to be a helpful part of that process. But we still, the process is not finalized. PRM made it clear that they're still checking in, the professional staff still checking in with supervisors and so forth to make sure that they have the process all officially approved and everything. So for now, what we're encouraging through a webinar last week and then also a call, a JFI call that we had yesterday, is for folks to be involved and increase the positive statements by elected leaders at the state and local level on behalf of refugees, for them to engage with refugees and with agencies so that there's that sort of personal commitment and involvement. And the same thing for federal officials, that they be directly engaged and involved as well in making positive statements. And for the state and local officials, part of that communication that's in the toolkit on JFI that folks can go to by going to the website is the whole thing of urging that support, and then down the line, whatever the final process is for consent, that the local elected official, state or local elected official would be ready and enthusiastic about granting that consent. So I would urge that we're going to continue. We've had like a couple different public communications exchanges with you all about this just since the consent order or the executive order came out on state consent. So we'll continue to have that high level of engagement with you. We're having follow-up calls as well with the Catholic Charities partners who do the resettlement to make sure we're on the same page, and then also with the state bishops' conferences on this. And we'll certainly circle back around and be in touch with you all as well, because I know everybody wants to be supportive during this important time and this important effort. Thanks for the good question.
Folks, I have just a little bit, just a tad after the top of the hour. On this last slide here on your monitors is the general JFI email box. If you have any questions that come up after the webinar, or if you need other resources, please send us an email, and we'll get back to you. We'll strive to get back to you, within 24 hours. I want to thank my colleagues Matt Wilch and Todd Scribner, as well as Matthew Westerbeck and his great staff out there in Portland, Oregon. Thank you for your great work. Thank you, folks, for joining us on this webinar today. We look forward to speaking with you again on October 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern. That's 11 a.m. Pacific. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.